Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm delighted that you are joining us here at the Center on National Security at Fordham Law virtually for a conversation with John Brennan and Ben Rhodes, here with us today to discuss America's global role, today's reality, tomorrow's challenges. Headlines in recent months have been filled with foreign policy challenges, from questions about a future Iranian nuclear deal to escalating tensions with China to the new configurations of global terrorist groups. Not to mention the global challenges posed by COVID, by climate change, and by displaced persons. To borrow a word, it's daunting, as John Brennan has written, referring to the sheer challenge of dealing with the substantive breadth and complexity of the US government's worldwide national security portfolio. Here to help us think about current realities and future options is John Brennan, as well as Ben Rhodes. So let me begin by introducing them. And before I do that, let me remind you that, of course, as we go along, you can put your questions into the Q&A and I will ask them as makes sense for the conversation. First, it's a pleasure to welcome once again John Brennan, Fordham graduate and currently a distinguished fellow for global security here at the Center on National Security at Fordham Law. Formerly director of the CIA, an assistant to the president for Homeland Security and Counterterrorism, John is currently a senior intelligence and security analyst for NBC, an advisor to a variety of public sector companies, a distinguished scholar at UT Austin, and the author of Undaunted, My Fight Against America's Enemies at Home and Abroad. It's my pleasure as well to introduce Ben Rhodes, his first time here at the center. Ben Rhodes was Deputy National Security Advisor to Barack Obama and currently wears many hats. He is the co-host of Pod Save America, a contributor to NBC and MSNBC, and a senior advisor to former President Obama. And he is the author most recently of After the Fall, Being American in the World We've Made, published this past June. Welcome, John. Welcome, Ben. And let me begin with a very big question, and then we can narrow it down and sort of follow your lead on where to take for more specific things. My big question is, given your experiences, how novel is today's array of global challenges in terms of complexity and the danger posed? So have some receded, others taken over? Are you more worried than you've been in the past? Where do you think we stand just in terms of the intensity and the dangers that we face? And John, let's begin with you.
Well, as a former national security practitioner and intelligence officer, I tend to look at all the things that worry us, and that litany of issues that you mentioned earlier just shows the array of challenges we face. And is this a novel time? Well, I think in many respects it is, just because we are now at 2021 and technology has changed our world, I think, fundamentally. And the accelerated pace of technological developments is certainly enhancing military capabilities, concerns about the digital domain, the increasing globalization of the world just shows how interconnected we are. I think COVID has demonstrated that, just how things happen in one part of the world affect other parts of the world. But from a US foreign policy perspective, I am very concerned about how this busy international environment is made even more daunting because of the array of domestic issues that the administration and that we face here internally. And so the amount of time to dedicate to some of those foreign issues that really require some very serious effort on the part of the US government working with foreign governments, I think it is a very novel and daunting time, and one that I think that we need to make sure that this administration and future administrations are going to be focusing not just on the headlines du jour, but on those more enduring, strategic, longer-term issues such as climate change, the development of the digital domain, other types of things like that.
Is there a region of the world that I'm following up with you, and then I'll get to Ben? Is there a region of the world that takes particular high priority in terms of concerns to you, or not? Are you really just seeing this as a complexity of global issues that intersect with one another?
Well, I think the entire globe presents their challenges for the United States in the various regions of the world, but I think that of most concern right now is China. Clearly, China is quite ascendant from the standpoint of developing its economic and its military capabilities. And some of the recent developments that we've seen, like the hypersonic missile tests that China launched last month or in August, and a few other things. There is real concern that China has a global ambition, and it's very strategic in terms of how it's implemented its policies and its aims. There is the ability of a Xi Jinping government to be able to follow through on a number of its initiatives because it doesn't have to worry about those 2-year or 4-year election cycles, unfortunately. And so I am concerned that China's growth and its challenge to the United States and many parts of the world, and especially in the East Asia, Western Pacific region, really requires U.S. attention. But we should not swing wildly to China and neglect all these other issues, because I think when we do that, we give insufficient attention to other issues that may be just simmering, but have the real potential to pose serious challenges to us in the future.
Ben, what do you think? Do you think that we're, starting at the beginning of this questioning, do you think that we're in a newly complex and dangerous period? Maybe being out of office, it seems, less intense, but seriously, do you think we are, or do you think things are escalating? And do you think that there are regions of the world that demand specific attention right now? Or do you see it more as just an array of global things, that all of which have to be addressed sort of at the same level?
Yeah, I would highlight two things, because look, there's a lot of problems, but your question is the right one. What's different now? The first is climate change. And so this is just a different scale of problem of anything that we've ever faced before. It's a new kind of issue in the sense that it's going to impact everybody. It already is impacting everybody. And every other trend that we could talk about, conflict, migration, all of it is exacerbated by climate change. So I think this is just a different order of magnitude issue. And governments aren't built to deal with climate change. And so it's going to take adaptation inside of governments, businesses, civil society, our own lives to deal with it. I think the second issue I'd highlight, I'm broadly obviously concerned about the decline and recession of democracy globally. I have a conversation late in my book that you referenced where Barack Obama actually asked me this question. Well, what's different today? There's been problems with authoritarianism throughout history. And I think the technology aspect is different. And it's different in two regards that are kind of two sides of the authoritarian coin when it comes to technology. One is the capacity for the mass spread of disinformation and conspiracy theory. 20 years ago, the number of people in this country who could believe that Donald Trump actually won the election, or that the world is governed by a cabal of sex traffickers, or whatever the conspiracy theory is, was inherently limited. And now you can have circumstances where like 45% of the country believes something that is just not true because they're living in a particular information ecosystem enabled by social media and technology. The other side of the technological coin is the capacity for mass surveillance. And if you look at what China's done with the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, and frankly, what they've done within their own borders generally, it's to kind of take the use of big data and the capacity to monitor everything that your people are doing and use that to assert social control. That's new. Even the police states of old did not have that capacity. So to me, those two things, climate and the intersection of technology and democracy, are the two things that we're just not really getting right to the scale, at least that we need to, and that are different. And those are not regional in nature. And I think that's part of what's challenging. We tend to think of foreign policy as, hey, what's our Middle East policy or our Europe policy? These are things that are harder in a way because they're not limited to one region.
Yeah, and that kind of brings me to another question. You mentioned the adaptation of institutions. John mentioned in his earlier comments about needing to have the institutional mechanisms in place for these new challenges. And I guess my question to both of you is, and I'm talking domestically right now, not in the international sphere, what, if anything, do you think the country might consider creating a new interagency group, or a series of new positions, a new, top position in a certain area? I mean, what's needed to be able to rethink the structure of foreign policy right now and global challenges. If you have any ideas, John or Ben, do you want me to start with you?
Go ahead, Ben.
I've thought about this a lot recently in the climate context, and I'm very curious what John thinks about this, because John worked at the pinnacle of essentially a separate apparatus that was constructed to deal with terrorism after 9/11, but that also integrated into the U.S. government. My experience with the climate issue, though, that was interesting as it got more prominent in the second Obama term, is that to get to the Paris Agreement, you didn't just need your climate negotiator, and the State Department had a climate envoy. You needed to make climate change the number one issue in just about every bilateral, multilateral relationship you have. So that when you're talking to China, you're talking to them about coal emissions. And when you're talking to South Korea, you're talking to them about the financing of coal plants. And when you're talking to Brazil, you're talking about deforestation. And so I've thought about this question of how do you demonstrate and elevate climate change to the principal national security challenge that it is in the government. And I actually don't think it's the creation of a separate structure. What I do think it is the US government very deliberately going out and saying, we are going to recruit and integrate climate experts across all aspects of American national security policy. We need climate experts working on the different regions at the NSC, working on the different regional bureaus at the State Department. And yes, I think you're going to need some specialized bureaucracy that is dealing with climate mitigation and climate migration. But to me, this is less setting up a new entity, but more how are you hiring and prioritizing expertise across the entire spectrum of the U.S. national security community. I mean, to take one example, the intelligence community, the amount of bandwidth and resources and collection and analysis that's going to have to go into understanding how climate change is going to impact everything from refugee flows to resource scarcity and competition, that requires a lot greater proportion of climate people with some degree of climate-based expertise relative to the way priorities have been in the past. So this to me is the biggest task in terms of reforming national security bureaucracy, building a climate capacity within it.
You know, John, you've watched a reorganization of government already after 9/11. And, in part putting intelligence capacities into offices and departments throughout, and terrorism specialty, counterterrorism specialties. How do you see the need for new patterns, new topics, new integration, as Ben is talking about? And are there any caveats that you would recommend in terms of rethinking how to approach this?
Well, to me, this is the most important and vexing challenge of the 21st century. How to address these issues internationally and nationally. When I think about climate change, the ecosystem for climate change is really limitless. And I don't think we are organized either domestically here in the United States or internationally to be able to tackle that issue, as well as digital issues and other types of things. So in the United States, for example, it's not just a government issue to deal with climate change and to enact policies. It also is a private sector and a not-for-profit sector. This is how do you organize the United States in terms of being able to engage all the relevant stakeholders in a manner that really is able to comprehensively address the issue. You can pass laws, you can have executive orders, you can do different types of things in the interagency of the U.S. government. But if you're not bringing on board the other elements of that ecosystem, you're not going to address it. And then when I think internationally, it's one of the real challenges and I think imperatives that we have is to find mechanisms to have much more effective international engagement and multilateral channels and opportunities to engage in these issues. Individual countries are not able to tackle these issues alone. That's why, and I really do support the Biden administration's effort to strengthen alliances and partnerships around the globe, because something as important as climate change really requires that collaboration, coordination, and integration of effort. So when I think about the US government, and a lot of the departments and agencies were set up in the 20th century, if not before, it was before all of these changes have taken place in our world, the globalized world, the interconnected world. the digital environment that we all operate within. And so I think we do need to adapt to the realities of today. But I think what we cannot do is just start from scratch. There obviously are legacy practices and institutions that we need to adapt to those new realities. But it's something that I think the United States can take a lead on, and to work as aggressively as possible with these international partners, the countries that we have the closest alliances with, but also those that we may have differences with.
You know, one of the things that the Biden administration has often also talked about is protection of human rights. They've talked a lot about building multilateral relationships and some new ones, and privileging them. But they've also talked a lot about the need to embed human rights into whatever foreign policy is coming. And my question is this getting harder and harder to do as we see so many human rights issues erupting and presenting themselves around the world? And is it possible to create these new mechanisms both at home and abroad, and to embed deeply human rights issues in a way that can actually help address security issues from the other side, which is to take care of people, to protect people? Or is this just a conversation that's going to be a standoff among nations? Ben, let's start with you.
Yeah, this is a complicated issue. I obviously welcome a focus on human rights. I think there's a couple challenges. One is that in general, the most important thing I think the United States can do on behalf of democracy and human rights globally is getting our own house in order. We're not setting a democratic example. And if you talk to, as I did for my book, I talked to a lot of dissidents, oppositionists, and other places, and they almost uniformly tell you that the most important thing the United States can do is live our values. And that's not what people are seeing in the United States in recent years. And so part of this is kind of reforming the wiring of our own democracy, but it's also that there's human rights challenges that emanate from US-based platforms. So for instance, Facebook has been a mechanism for the spread of hate speech and the demagoguery of immigrants or refugees or minority populations. And we've seen that lead to real world consequences in terms of human rights violations in Sri Lanka and Myanmar and the Philippines and many other places. So actually, regulating social media platforms in this country is a human rights issue globally. And I think we have to understand that the most impactful thing we can do is not always just kind of issuing a lecture to some other country, but it's fixing the wiring of what's emanating from our society. I think globally, what concerns me in this space is there's issues where I'd like to see us leading that are kind of usually slotted in the human rights category, right? Refugee admissions and treatment around the world, for instance, comes to mind, or international law, and which has suffered in recent years trying to refortify international law. I think this often becomes challenging when the U.S. is tied in knots because of some of our foreign relations and some of our domestic politics. The world sees us selectively commenting on human rights when it kind of is good domestic politics to bash China but not to stand up to Egypt. And so I personally have long felt that we have suffered dramatically in terms of our credibility to speak out on certain issues when the world sees us so selectively enforce them. I'm a realist enough, and I've been in government to know that there's no such thing as total purity and consistency and absence of hypocrisy in the complicated world. But when you have a country like Egypt that is currently, locking up tens of thousands of political prisoners, probably just encouraged an anti-democratic coup in Sudan, and we're shoveling money out the door to them, I don't know that people are going to listen to you when you say that you've made human rights like the focus of your foreign policy. So it's hard, but I would argue that in addition to getting our own house in order and trying to fortify international norms, we have to do more, at least, to show that we get it and that we're trying to address some of our own inconsistencies.
Yeah, and your book is very much sort of a critique of us at home, sort of, where the idea of American exceptionalism has taken us. John, what do you think in terms of the ability to embed the human rights agenda into foreign policy, national security agenda globally? Do you think that it's something that we need to, address at home as well as abroad? And one of our questions, which our questioners asked, Michael German asked, do you believe that it would be consistent with the policy of extending human rights, and I'm paraphrasing here, to guarantee security to Taiwan? And how would you place that question? What should we do vis-a-vis Taiwan? Should we, or what can we do?
Well, it's happened during the Obama administration. Ben and I have, I think, very similar views and agree on this. I think we do need to look at what we are here at home. We're supposed to be the model, the exemplar for the world of democratic values, principles, and also human rights. And we still have a long way to go here. But also, I worked in 6 administrations, and I must tell you, it's a lot easier for administrations of both political party to criticize adversaries, the Chinas and Russias and Irans of the world, as opposed to taking issue with some of our partners. And I couldn't agree more when it comes to Egypt. When I look at what's going on right now, and President el-Sisi, I had great hopes that el-Sisi would move away from Egypt's authoritarian past, but he's disappointed me. I look at Saudi Arabia. I was disappointed that the Biden administration did not take a harder line vis-a-vis Mohammed bin Salman when the report came out that he was responsible for the murder of Khashoggi. And so I do think that we need to speak out because I think that's what our country, our values demand. But also, I think we set a tone for others. But that doesn't mean just bashing foreign states. I think one of the reasons why the Obama administration decided to move ahead with a rapprochement with Cuba was to see whether or not improved relations could, in fact, result in improved human rights conditions in Cuba. Moving forward with the Iranian nuclear agreement was an effort to try to strengthen the force of moderation inside of Iran. So I think there are many different mechanisms to address human rights issues. And you can define it broadly to include things like Taiwan security or narrowly. But I do think the United States really has to be at the lead for this, because as the leader of the Western world, of the democratic world, of the free, liberal, democratic order, I think what we do makes a big difference. And that's why I was so disappointed and outspoken during the Trump administration, because I don't think that the Trump administration really took into account the importance of being the principal global advocate for human rights around the globe.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that both of you alluded to in your first remarks was what Ben writes about, which is democracy versus authoritarianism, and how that is sort of engulfing the conversation that we're having. And one of the things you alluded to, John, and I'd like to hear you both speak on, is what the domestic disarray and the domestic polarization does in your estimation to the global conversation, and not just in terms of what Ben was talking about in terms of sort of pushing aside human rights on our own and civil liberties in so many ways, but just in terms of the view from abroad on what discord and disarray means within the United States. Does it really matter in terms of how others deal with us in the world, or does it not? And Ben, we'll start with you because you write about this. So let's start.
Yeah, I think it matters enormously. And look, some of this is just we're such a massive presence in people's lives globally that they consume what's happening here. And if they're consuming Donald Trump and January 6th, that's obviously not a message you want to send. But I think it goes deeper than that. Americans have to understand the ways in which it goes deeper than that. I look at Hungary in my book, where Viktor Orban has basically consolidated control from a liberal democracy to a fairly single party autocracy by redrawing parliamentary districts to entrench his party in power, packing the courts there with far-right judges who would find in favor of his agenda, enriching some cronies on the outside who bought up the media and turned it into a far-right propaganda machinery, making use of social media to kind of lock people in ecosystems of conspiracy theory, and changing the voting laws to make it easier for some people to vote his supporters and harder for others, and wrapping this all up in a nationalist us versus them message, demagoguing immigrants and Muslims and even George Soros. This is a playbook when you have anti-democratic tactics that are utilized in the United States, other people do that. Bolsonaro mimicked Trump's campaign in Brazil. I could go on and on. And so the example the United States set and the interconnection between what I would term the kind of nationalist authoritarian movements is clear and happening kind of before our eyes. And so this is not something that is just a political tactic in the United States. It's a trend globally that the authoritarian aspect of American politics is interacting with and fueling and learning best practices from. And we certainly see this in the online discourse, where you have very common conspiracy theories and narratives that service a national authoritarian set of politics. So in that way, we are contributing to and on the receiving end of a trend that has very much to do with what's happening here. I think we can turn that inside out in a way, in the sense that, now the rest of the world has seen, well, and I should add one more thing, is this is happening at the exact time when China is putting forward a different model and saying, hey, our model may guarantee you no freedoms, but it's more stable, it's less chaotic, there's no January 6th happening over here. And that's attractive to some countries that are on the fence. And that's, you see more countries in places like Africa breaking in the direction of the Chinese model in recent years. I do think if we can fight through it, because now the rest of the world sees America can have a mob storm its parliament. That's something that is not uncommon in some parts of the world. Or America can have a corrupt autocrat with the son-in-law who works down the hall. That's also not unusual in the world. So we're kind of now like everybody else. And if we can fight through it and save our own democracy, I actually think that can set a very relative counterexample. So that's at least the hope.
Well, that's interesting for us to be the model of how to get out of this.
How to get out of it. Yeah, exactly.
John, do you think it affects how negotiations go on among other countries and with us in terms of who is the United States exactly? What are we dealing with? Can we trust them? Are they a reliable partner anymore? Do you think that's suffered in recent times? And is that, if so, is that recoupable, or are basically things going on as they always have?
No, I think there has been a marked change in the way folks around the globe looking at the United States and our role in global affairs. Just over the past several days, I've been on a number of Zoom sessions with people from different parts of the world. And there were several things that came out. One is that, as we've talked about, they believe that the United States right now is not a very good example for democracy in action and effective democratic systems. Which they're very concerned about, because given that we see the rise of authoritarian regimes and systems in different places, the United States is supposed to be that model of the value of democracy. And right now, we're not showing a lot of that. Number two, I think there's a real concern that they're seeing increasing nativism in the United States, and that the United States is, a large part of the United States electorate and populace is pulling back from its traditional engagement in international affairs, and just focusing on the United States. Unfortunately, Trump's mantra of America first still has resonance in large parts of the United States, and people abroad see that. And so they wonder whether or not that role that the United States has played for the last 75 years of being that global leader of liberal democratic order is going to continue. And then third, they're also concerned that the strong polarization within the United States and the left and the right is likely to undermine what they believe is important continuity in U.S. policies internationally. And they recognize that every 2 or 4 years, you could have a change of president or a change of control in the Congress, which has a profound impact on foreign policy. So I think they do see an unsettled United States going through this period of transition from the 20th century experience that they had with us, dealing with the aftermath of 9/11, and now with other challenges. So I think, like Ben, I do believe that they're watching very carefully at the United States and to see how we're going to weather the current challenges, and whether or not we're going to be able to navigate successfully sort of out of what we have right now, which is, in many respects, a dysfunctional Congress and government that is not really up to the task that I think is before us.
One of our audience asked a question about institutional obstacles to principled policies, with a reference to, the moniker of the deep state. And I'm just wondering, in terms of thinking about going forward along the lines of what Ben has laid out, what it means to have a laden institutional bureaucracy that maybe is living in the past instead of in the future. So instead of, talking about the deep state necessarily, just talking about the baggage of the past rather than the future. And that's one question. And the other question, just following on what you've said, John, is implicit in what you said is some notion about what does it mean that our president can be here for only very short term when other authority figures and leaders in other countries can be there for maybe even life terms. And how does that impact the position of the United States in the world in terms of your view? So John, let's start with you on the president's question, just because I want to hear what you have to say. And then Ben will go on to you for the other question, which I will repeat.
Well, yeah, it makes democracy can be messy, and democracy has its challenges. And when people look at authoritarian regimes around the world, and sometimes they're attracted to it, it's because I think they see that strong men, usually strong people, are able to make changes, but usually it is to advance the interests of subgroups within their country, and it comes at the expense of political liberties and rights and freedoms. So I think up until recently, even though there were different political agendas and platforms of Republican and Democratic candidates for president, there was still a fair amount of continuity in U.S. foreign policy. I think that the Trump era was an anomaly, and I hope it's a one-time anomaly. But it's one of the beauties and benefits of, as well as the challenges of our democratic system, is that our citizens get the opportunity to elect their leaders. And so there will be changes. I live in the state of Virginia, and we just elected a Republican governor. And it's the right of Virginians to choose who they want to lead. But that leads to some disruptions. But I think the overall trajectory is in a positive direction. And unfortunately, I think some of these authoritarian examples, if you're just looking purely at economic growth or some things, give a distorted view of the benefits of those regimes.
I would add, I just real quick on that, I would add that the congressional role here is much more important than people understand, and it interacts with the bureaucracy. Because what happens, I think for many decades, there were differences between administrations on priorities and things, but there was kind of a constancy to the building blocks of American foreign policy. And if you started something, you knew it was going to be funded. Or if you worked in the bureaucracy, you kind of knew what the lines within which you were working. One of the things I experienced, for instance, is the bureaucracy is afraid of the radicalization in Congress because they know administrations are going to come and go, but they know that Congress is not going to go. And so, it's hard to do certain things, like if you're trying to normalize relations with Cuba, for instance, people in the bureaucracy are worried about being punished by people in Congress for just executing the policy of the United States of America. And that's just one particular issue, but I think more broadly, what we've seen is, and I hate to say it, I like John, I started out, not wanting to be particularly partisan, writing speeches for Barack Obama about, red states and blue states. The radicalization that took place and has taken place in the Republican Party, for instance, when you look at what happened on Benghazi, they were still investigating State Department officials at the end of the Trump administration, 8 years after that event that took place. The chilling effect that has on the bureaucracy, the diplomats who don't want to take risks anymore, the people who don't want to put things, people who feel like they are going to be unduly kind of singled out and punished if they are crosswise with a particularly virulent member of Congress, a Josh Hawley or Ted Cruz. Just look right now, you've got holds on every single Biden national security nominee. So Congress has gone from contributing to and informing, but maintaining the consistency of American foreign policy to really politicizing it to a degree that the bureaucracy lives in fear of that. And that to me is a bigger problem than any so-called deep state.
What about the Middle East, John? What do you think what's happening? It seems that there's so many revisions and reversions and new alliances and breaking of old alliances. And it doesn't seem to be headed towards any stable ground, or maybe I'm, being too hyperbolic about it. But what do you've worked on the Middle East since you were very young. What do you think? Is it really headed towards a complete and more chaos that we've seen now? Or do you see efforts being made that you would promote, that you would recommend, that could help stabilize the region? I don't necessarily mean from the United States, just, whither the Middle East.
Well, I am heartened by reports that the U.S. talks with Iran as far as the restarting of the U.S. engagement in the Iran nuclear deal are going to take place this month. I think that's critically important. We need to stop any type of further Iranian advancement toward the development of a nuclear weapon. A lot depends on enlightened leadership in the Middle East. I mean, the Middle East, the countries in the Middle East, they're facing a world of challenges. When I think about Iraq and Syria and Yemen, and Libya, recovering from the domestic conflict and struggles that are there, and the suffering that is going on, and the need for external assistance to a lot of these countries in order for them to be able to develop the infrastructure and economic opportunities for their people. Rebuilding, the educational systems of medical facilities, it's really quite daunting. And unfortunately, a lot of these authoritarian leaders continue to focus on their interests and the interests of their tribe or their elite supporters. And this is where I really do think it comes down to a lot of those countries in the Middle East that do have great oil, natural gas wealth. Need to be thinking about what they can do to contribute to the development of the region as a whole. When Ben and I were in the White House, it was when the Arab Spring broke out, and the Arab Spring gave rise to a lot of hopes that democracy was going to flourish in the Middle East. But as we well know here in the United States, after 240 plus years, democracy is not a light switch. It's a journey that has to be developed and nurtured. And so the Middle East has, I think, a lot of challenges ahead of it. But I do think that there are areas that the United States needs to continue to focus on, again, to address the plight of so many individuals who are suffering because of either conflict or because of economic deprivation. And I'll make a pitch once again for the United States to try to address the plight of the Palestinian people. I think this is important. You can do that while still ensuring that you're going to provide the security assistance and support to the state of Israel. But the Palestinian people, I think, are long deserving of realizing their rights.
Ben, following up on that and turning the focus a little more, what about Afghanistan? A couple of our questioners have asked about Afghanistan. What about Afghanistan? The United States has pulled out. It seems that there's a kind of, depends on how you tell the story, right? It's either tremendous chaos or tremendous control in ways that are contrary to what the United States would have liked and other countries would have liked to see. What do you think? And a follow-up question on that to your earlier, do you think the reporting on what's happening in Afghanistan has been adequate to the task?
I mean, in terms of going forward in Afghanistan, look, we are where we are, and I'm worried about the humanitarian situation in Afghanistan, because what happens, the U.S. pulls out, the Taliban takes over, and we kind of reimpose all these sanctions, kind of like just pulling a lever. And one of the things I'm concerned with broadly in American foreign policy is overuse of sanctions. I mean, and that's going to lead to acute food shortages. That's going to compound the suffering of people that have already suffered because of the war we fought in Afghanistan. I don't think those sanctions are going to dislodge the Taliban. I think we need to be finding ways to provide humanitarian support to the Afghan people. I think we have a moral responsibility to do that. I don't understand how you can sit down and engage the Taliban and make a deal with them that excludes the Afghan government. And then when the logical endpoint of that deal, them returning to government, takes place, then you sanction the whole country. I mean, so yes, there's counterterrorism needs there that the Biden team is going to try to deal with through an intelligence basis. in an over-the-horizon basis, but I would be addressing the acute humanitarian challenge. I think on the reporting generally over the years, I mean, that's a backward-looking question, and the policy itself, obviously, was far too kind of U.S.-centric and U.S. military-centric in particular, that in our policies and in the reporting and the way in which the world was kind of consumed, the perspective of the Afghan people was absent. And that, I'm not just saying that as kind of like, out of the goodness of my heart. I think that there were some warning signs that Afghan civil society has been raising for years about the corruption in their own government. There were warning signs about the corruption across the country. And frankly, I'll say it because so John doesn't, there were warning signs from the American intelligence community for forever about this wasn't going in the direction that that often the military suggested it was, and often political leadership suggested it was, and often congressional supporters of the war in Afghanistan did. And so to me, it's the broader lesson is in circumstances like Afghanistan going forward, and hopefully those aren't just wars, but those are, we need to do a better job of listening to an array of voices on the ground, and not just the ones who will tell us what we want to hear.
And among those voices, where does the private sector play a role? And I mean, I'm including in this NGOs, private companies that either are corporations or even think tanks that have a global reach. Both of you have been in the private sector now. Is in terms of the overall diplomatic picture, is the private sector something that needs to be involved? Certainly in cybersecurity issues, you have it's reliant on the input of private actors. What about in thinking about national security generally? Is in addition to the government function, how much is there a reliance for anything from humanitarian concerns to more strategic political concerns? Where does the private sector, or should the private sector, or does the private sector have a role? John, do you want to start with you?
Well, I think it has a very important role across all the various sectors. When you think about finance and trade and business and commerce, U.S. companies, U.S. banking institutions, others really have a global presence and are looked to by many other countries to realize some of their goals and objectives. I do think that the United States soft power is something that we really need to try to emphasize. I was always a strong advocate of having American culture be propagated as much as possible throughout the world, so we can penetrate some of these denied areas, and so that people's eyes can be opened up to what exists outside of maybe their closed societies. And so I do think that the U.S. government, again, taking into account the reality of where we are today and the challenges of tomorrow, that we need to recognize the interconnectedness of this globalized world and the importance of trying to ensure that all the different elements of American power, soft, hard power, whatever, are going to find reach to different corners of the world. I don't want the world's population to be viewing the United States just through the prism of the U.S. soldier or Guantanamo or other types of things that tend to conjure up in their minds, images of American oppression. It really needs to, the United States needs to demonstrate that democracy has real advantages, and the development of American society has really contributed not just to the advancement of the American people, but to global health and prosperity. But we need to really try to ensure that we're going to try to harness all those capabilities here, and by engaging overseas.
Ben, do you see any downside to relying and integrating the private sector in a truly integrated, comprehensive way, or do you think it's basically the only reality going forward?
Well, I first of all, I think you absolutely need to, and they can give you you can get different perspectives, right? I mean, in the civil, for this book, my recent book After the Fall, I basically was talking to opposition figures, and Alexei Navalny in Russia can give you a perspective on Russia that it's pretty interesting and different than even the very best analysts in the intelligence community could give me, right? Or the experience of younger Hong Kong protesters, kind of learned more from just hearing about their life story about creeping Chinese kind of totalitarianism than, yeah, anything I could read if it's signals intelligence about Chinese intentions, right? So I think the texture of what's happening in the world is more easily understood the wider net of information you cast. And John's right. When I've engaged with international American financial institutions in places like Singapore or Hong Kong, I learn a lot about what's going on over there with Chinese influence in ways that are harder to gauge from a governmental perspective. What does it mean when there used to be competitive bidding for something in a Singapore and now there's not, because everybody knows there's only one bid that matters, it's the Chinese one, right? And now the risks, as you ask, are, as with the US government, any private entity has their own interests, right? An NGO is trying to influence you to take a certain action. Private businesses certainly have their own financial interests that may inform what they choose to emphasize in conversations with people in government. I've had an interesting experience being out of government where you get a more unvarnished view of things, because you recognize when you're in government, of course, that everybody has an angle when they're approaching you, right? So that's the challenge, is just you should be working, and John has overseen the analytical capacity of the CIA, which is enormous. And he's also been a consumer of intelligence, so he knows this well, but you have to not only cast a wide net, you have to know, hey, where's this information coming from? And if it's intended to influence, even if it's from a good place, I need to know that.
Yeah. John, a couple of people have asked about non-state actors. So we're talking about all these other big issues, and in particular, terrorist organizations. It seems to that in the priority of things that you read about Washington focusing on, although experts in terrorism and counterterrorism talk a lot about new groups, new alliances, even the re-empowerment of Al-Qaeda and what's happening with ISIS. Do you think that non-state actors that there's still needs to be the same amount of attention to non-state actors? Is this are we thinking about it in the right ways? Do we need to rethink how we've thought about non-state actors going forward, or not? What do you think?
Well, I think these non-state actors, these transnational groups in particular, are the ones that are of concern, because especially if they have a violent agenda. And look at ISIS-K, ISIS Khorasan, right now in Afghanistan, which is seen as a growing menace, not just inside of Afghanistan, but also regionally and against U.S. interests. So although we need to focus on things like climate change and China and Russia, Iran, North Korea, and so on, these various groups that have violent agendas that are non-state actors is something that I think we have to continue to ensure that our intelligence capabilities are robust enough so that we can detect any types of threats before they come to a violent act. This is again a feature of this interconnected world, and the fact that a lot of these non-state actors not only can burrow into regions of the world that are hard for us to gain insight into, but also they take advantage of the digital environment that transcends sovereign borders. And one of the things about ISIS in Syria, as they were a magnet for individuals coming from all different parts of the world, these were very technically sophisticated individuals that had sophisticated communication systems, propaganda systems, and were able to reach out. And so they present a challenge, aside from the fact that they don't have the resources of a sovereign state. They do bring with them quite a bit of capability. And so therefore, I think it is something that we're going to have to continue to focus on, but also understand how they are adapting to the realities of the current day.
Ben, I'd like you to talk a little bit about non-state actors, because it's not, you kind of organized after the fall in terms of thinking about, who these authoritarian governments are and a number of other issues. But where do you see the threat of non-state actors, terrorism going forward? Is it just something to be managed, that we have the intelligence capacity now to, and law enforcement capacity to detect along with our allies around the world? How do you see this? Do you see this as putting more pressure on, making that part of what we put more pressure on to state actors just talk us a little bit about this.
Yeah, I like what I believe about this is that at a certain point, we have to trust that with all the investments we've made in intelligence and law enforcement capacity and homeland security capacity, that can deal with the problem. the John Brennans and Lisa Monacos of the world, we don't need to have a large military infrastructure in other countries to deal with it, and that we're dismantling some aspects of not the intelligence and law enforcement piece, as John was emphasizing, but rather the military platforms and military presence that we've had in multiple countries. Because part of that is having some faith in those capacities that we built and invested a lot of money into. Part of that is a need to rebalance prioritization to some of the other things that we've talked about that. Part of that is understanding sometimes that there's degrees of assistance we provide to other countries that, have their own interests in fighting terrorism. And, I mentioned Egypt earlier, and I tell this anecdote in the book, but like we got into a loop with Egypt where they're radicalizing people in prisons, the government itself, because having radicalized people then justifies the billions of dollars we give them to be an ally in the war on terror. So to me, I think there's a right sizing that doesn't take our eye off of it. I mean, because if you work in the U.S. government, the impressive investments in the capacity and professionals at the National Counterterrorism Center or the CIA or in the FBI's counterterrorism divisions, I have faith in that. I have enough faith in that I don't think we need the kind of military presence that we have in lots of places, and that we can return to kind of a more normal legal basis. And I think ending the 2001 authorization for the use of military force and having something that's far more narrowly tailored and specific about who we're going after and where we're going after them for what period of time, that's part of kind of normalizing this. And I think that sometimes it's treated like it's a binary choice. Like either you take this seriously by doing all these totally extraordinary things, or you're not taking it seriously. No, I think we can take it seriously in a more normal post 9/11 context.
Yeah, the sunsetting or repeal or replacement of the authorization for the use of military force 2001 seemed to have some momentum before the drawdown from Afghanistan, and then in sort of the chaos that ensued, sort of the support for it went away. Do you think this is actually possible in coming year?
I would hope so. I mean, there's not only Democratic support, but there've been increasing Republican support, and you see in some of the kind of more libertarian Republican voices support for this. It comes down, for whatever reason, it's still perceived as like a political risk to say that we don't need an authorization that's been in place for 20 years, and because nobody wants to be responsible for writing and voting for the new one. But man, how can we defend as an exemplar of democracy, the rule of law, and the laws of war globally, that it makes any sense legally, morally, or from even a policy basis to be fighting using military action in multiple countries in 2022 off of something that was written in 2001.
Right, in response to the attacks of 9/11.
Yeah.
John, would you agree with that it's time to move on from the 2001 authorization and repeal or replace with specific enemies, specific timeframes, specific geography, something specific?
Yes, I do. I think the President of the United States has inherent Article 2 powers that allows him or her to respond to crises or urgent requirements on the security front. But there is a requirement, I think, for there to be this consultation with Congress so that if we're going to get involved in any type of longer term commitment, there needs to be, I think, an ongoing review. And the AUMFs that have been in place for so long, I think they were useful to deal with the Al-Qaeda phenomenon in the aftermath of 9/11. But it's 20 years afterward. I think we need to update those arrangements that allow us to address our national security concerns and threats.
In our final moments, I want to talk about the people in these various countries of the world. I mean, one of the things that gets lost sometimes in talking about policy is who the individuals in these countries are that we're making arrangements with on any level, diplomatic, military, et cetera. And in the pullout from Afghanistan, one of the striking things has been the number of Americans that have personal ties with Afghans, that feel very strongly about individuals there. And what I'm curious about is, do you think that there's a way to, this is maybe an old-fashioned question, but to create an environment where there are more personal connections globally between populations in a way that can also contribute to global stability and respect among countries? Does it, and what I'm really asking is, how much of this can be taken perhaps out of the leadership level, even though that's very important and what we've been talking about and essential, but also done at a different level that address where human beings are connecting to one another. And these are not just about the type of government, the economic consequences of certain policies, et cetera. Either of you have any thoughts on this, or do you think that that's just old fashioned?
I'll go first so John can wrap from his perspective, because I want to refer to that. But I couldn't agree more with the premise of your question, and I'll give two comments on this. I mean, the first is on Americans need to see the consequences of our policies through the prism of people. As John mentioned, I worked on Cuba and normalizing relations. It's very easy to sit in the United States and support the embargo on Cuba and all these sanctions on Cuba through the prism of our Cuba politics. When you go to Cuba, as John and I have, and you see a degree of poverty 90 miles from Florida that rivals anything you could see anywhere in the world, it becomes impossible to defend the US embargo on Cuba that has imprisoned those people in that poverty. Sure, their government has some responsibility for it, but the reason they're driving old cars is not because they want to. It's because they literally cannot purchase new cars because of US sanctions. So part of this is just seeing, like, hey, when we hear about a sanction or a war or whatever, we don't see the human beings there. It's weird to the extent to which the Washington conversation drains the humanity out of it. But then part of it is also just, I think there'd be better outcomes and there'd be less rivalry and tribalism and festering resentments. And so I would support, if I could do anything, absent constraint, I think much scaling up dramatically programs that give young Americans opportunities to go overseas, whether that's Peace Corps or anything else that we can, and there are a number of programs obviously the US government sponsors, but I think seeing it as a national interest to have more Americans that are exposed to people overseas, and significantly bringing there's been no more successful foreign policy, I think, in the United States for 70 years than foreign exchange students coming here. The prime ministers of countries, the elites of countries, but also just the human interaction. It makes no sense to not be doing everything we can to keep those numbers up and drive them up higher. So I'm for doing anything we can to see people and the consequences of our policies, but also to create those interconnections.
Interesting. John, you agree?
I couldn't agree with Ben more. I do think that human enlightenment, wisdom, really comes with having as much exposure as possible to the rest of the globe and the world. Now, I'm biased in this respect because I had the opportunity to go to Indonesia when I was 18 and spend a summer there, go to Egypt, Cairo, and study in college. And it really opened my eyes to see not just foreign cultures and societies, but also to see the United States from afar. And I do think it's important to have that very broad prism so that you can really understand that the world is a big place, that yes, you may have a place in it, but I think if you don't want to have a distorted view of the globe, you really need to have a better understanding and appreciation of what's happening in the globe. And it's an evolving world, certainly with technology and other types of things. But sitting in one's home and just looking at the world through your own very parochial prism and wanting things to benefit yourself and not understanding just how, again, interconnected this globe is in a globalized world, I really think it does a disservice to trying to tackle these problems in a manner that I think is going to be effective. So student exchange programs, other types of things, bringing people to the United States for leadership training and business opportunities, having as much interaction as possible. I mean, that's why the United States, I think, was such a force of democracy. It's been a melting pot. It's brought people from all different walks of life together. And to see that there's much more that we share in common than that separates us. So yes, I'd like to think that in this century, we're going to have more opportunities to really find ways to break down those barriers that exist between peoples around the globe.
So in conclusion, as we come out of COVID, where we really haven't been able to do that, the added impetus to connect, to see one another, should extend as far as it can, maybe bring us closer to the world and the world closer to us. John Brennan, Ben Rhodes, thank you so much for this conversation. And I look forward to the next one. Thank you all for joining and for your questions.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.